There is a place in Bangladesh that most people will never see. Not because it is hidden, not because it is secret, but because no one wants to look. It sits behind walls so thick, so tall, that the city around it seems to forget it exists. People walk past it every day. They buy fruit from the street vendors nearby. They argue about traffic. They laugh with their friends. And just a few meters away, on the other side of that wall, other human beings are living a completely different kind of life. A life where the sun looks different. A life where silence feels dangerous. A life where some men have been waiting, for decades, for a single piece of paper that will decide whether they live or die. This is the story of Dhaka Central Jail, one of the oldest, most overcrowded, and most secretive prisons in all of South Asia. And today, we are going to go inside. But before we do, there is something you need to understand about this place. Most prisons around the world are built to hold criminals, to punish them, to keep them away from society. Dhaka Central Jail does all of that, but it also holds something else. It holds people who have not been convicted of anything, people who were arrested, brought inside, and then left, waiting for a trial that may not come for years, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 10. There are men inside Dhaka Central Jail right now who went in when they were young and came out, if they came out, as old men. Not because they were found guilty, but simply because the system forgot them. That is the first mystery of this place, and it is not the last. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this story goes much, much deeper than you think, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Dhaka Central Jail is not a new place. It is not a modern building with security cameras and clean corridors. It has history, dark, heavy history that stretches back over 200 years. It was first built in 1788. That was during the time of the British Empire, when Bangladesh was not yet a country. It was part of a vast colonial territory called British India. The British needed a place to lock up people who resisted their rule, people who spoke too loudly, people who asked too many questions. So they built a prison in the heart of Old Dhaka, on land that had once been part of a Mughal fort. Think about that for a moment. The ground that prison sits on has been a place of power and confinement for centuries. First a fort, then a colonial jail, layer after layer of history, pressed into the same earth. For over 200 years, that jail stood in Old Dhaka. It watched the British leave. It watched Bangladesh become East Pakistan, then fight for its freedom in 1971, then become the nation it is today. Through all of it, through wars, revolutions, assassinations, that prison stood. And then, in 2016, it moved. The government built a brand new facility across the river, in an area called Karanaganj. Bigger walls, more space, a capacity for over 4,500 prisoners. The old site in Old Dhaka, all those acres of land in the middle of the city, was turned into a cultural center and museum. But the new building didn't solve the problem. It never does. Because here is the truth about Dhaka Central Jail today. It was built for roughly 4,500 people. That is its official capacity. That is how many beds, how many cells, how much food it was designed to handle. Right now, it holds more than 12,000 people. Read that again. 12,000. In a space built for 4,500. That means 3 people sleeping where 1 person was supposed to sleep. Men pressed against each other in the heat of the Bangladeshi summer, with little ventilation, little medical care, and little hope of things changing soon. There are cells inside Dhaka Central Jail that were built for 40 men and hold 120. This is not a rumor. This is not an exaggeration. This has been documented by human rights organizations, by journalists, by lawyers who walk those halls. And yet, most of those 12,000 people have not been found guilty of anything. According to official Bangladesh prison statistics, roughly 80% of the people inside the country's prisons at any given time are under trial prisoners. That means they are waiting for their case to be heard in court. They have not been convicted. Under law, they are still innocent. But they are locked inside, sometimes for years, because they could not afford bail, or because their paperwork got lost, or simply because there are not enough judges to hear all the cases fast enough. The courts are backed up. The system is overwhelmed. And the people who pay the price for that are the ones already behind the walls. Deep inside Dhaka Central Jail, past the general population, past the under-trial wards, past the sections for women and juveniles, there is a part of the prison that most people, even most prisoners, never see. It has a name, the condemned cell. A condemned cell is where you go when a court has looked at the evidence, listened to the arguments, and decided you should die. Not die in prison. Not die of old age behind bars. Die by hanging. On a specific date. At a specific time. The condemned cell is where you wait for that moment. In Bangladesh, the condemned cell is a small room. Roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. About the size of a very small bathroom. There is no window to the outside world. There is a metal door. There is a thin mat to sleep on. There is a bucket. That is it. That is the world of a man on death row. And some of them have been living in that world, in that 6 by 8 foot room, for over 10 years. Some for 15. A few for more than 20. Because in Bangladesh, being sentenced to death does not mean you will be executed quickly. The legal process continues after sentencing. There are appeals. There is a review by the High Court. There is the possibility of a presidential pardon. And all of that takes time. Years. Sometimes decades. So the men in the condemned cell wait. Every day. Every night. Not knowing if today is the day they will hear footsteps coming for them. Before we go further, I want to ask you something in the comments. If you were locked in a room that size, with no windows, no news from outside, no way to know when or if you would be let out, what is the first thing you would think about? Tell me in the comments. Because the answers from the men who actually lived this will change the way you see everything. In 2020, researchers from the University of Dhaka did something unusual. They decided to find out who these men actually were. Not the criminals that newspapers described. Not the monsters that court documents painted. But the actual human beings sitting in those condemned cells. They could get direct access to the prisoners. The prison system in Bangladesh is extremely difficult to enter for researchers. So instead, they interviewed the families. 39 families of death row prisoners. They also studied the case files of hundreds more. What they found was not what most people expected. The men on death row in Bangladesh were not, for the most part, wealthy. They were not powerful. They were not gang leaders or crime bosses living lavish lives. They were farmers, day laborers, rickshaw drivers, men who earned just enough to feed their families on a good day. Most had never finished school. Many had never had a stable job. And when they were arrested, often far from home, often confused, often terrified, the majority could not afford a lawyer. Some were given legal aid lawyers, lawyers provided by the state for those who can't pay. But those lawyers were sometimes overworked, sometimes underprepared, sometimes meeting their client for the very first time on the day of the trial. And then there was something else the researchers found, something that made the whole picture darker. A third of the families, 33%, said that their loved one had been tortured during police interrogation. Not pushed around, not roughed up, tortured, beaten to the point of confessing to things they may or may not have done. In any criminal system, a confession is powerful. It can be the difference between going home and going to the condemned cell. And if that confession was pulled out of a terrified, beaten man who just wanted the pain to stop, the question of guilt becomes very complicated. The researchers were not saying all these men were innocent. They were saying, we don't fully know. And in a system where the stakes are this high, where the punishment is death, not knowing is a very dangerous thing. But the condemned cell is only one part of this story. Because there is something else inside Dhaka Central Jail. Something that most people don't know about. Something that sat quietly in this prison for decades, doing its work in the dark, known only to the people who were there. It is connected to some of the most dramatic moments in Bangladesh's history, to a massacre that happened in the middle of the night, to executions that were ordered so fast that men never even had time to say goodbye, and to one man, a man who walked the corridors of this prison as a prisoner himself, but who was given a very unusual job, a job that no one wanted, a job that changed him forever. His story is unlike anything you have heard before, and it starts at midnight. In Dhaka is not quiet. Even in the deepest hours of the night, the city breathes. Rickshaws scrape against pavement. Dogs bark somewhere far away. A baby cries in a nearby apartment. The city never fully sleeps. But inside the walls of Dhaka Central Jail, midnight means something different. Inside those walls, midnight is when things happen that cannot happen in daylight. Things that require darkness. Things that the morning sun is not meant to see. And on certain nights, special nights, marked on no public calendar, the guards inside the condemned section would begin to move differently. Quieter, more deliberate. The regular noise of the prison would settle into something heavier. Something that the other prisoners could feel even if they couldn't see it. Because they all knew. When the footsteps came after midnight, they were not coming for everyone. They were coming for one person. The process of an execution in Bangladesh follows a specific ritual. It has rules. It has steps. And it begins not with the hangman, but with a piece of paper. When a man is sentenced to death in Bangladesh, the case automatically goes to the High Court for review. The judges look at everything again: the evidence, the trial, the sentence. They can reduce the sentence. They can send it back. Or they can confirm it. If they confirm it, the prisoner has one last door to knock on. The president of Bangladesh has the power to grant clemency, to say, this man will not die. His sentence will be changed to life in prison. Many families spend everything they have trying to reach that door: hiring lawyers, writing petitions, traveling to Dhaka from villages far away, carrying documents and photographs and letters, hoping someone will listen. Most of the time, no one does. When the president's office sends back the petition, denied, a date is set. That date is not announced publicly. The prisoner is not told weeks in advance. In most cases, the condemned man finds out only a day or two before, sometimes less. And then the ritual begins. The night before an execution, the prisoner is moved. He is taken from his condemned cell and brought to a separate room, a preparation room, closer to the gallows. He is given a bath. The water, according to tradition, is mixed with herbs. He is given clean white clothes. He is offered a meal, whatever he asks for, within reason: rice, fish, a sweet, whatever he wants. A religious leader comes. 4 Muslim prisoners, and most prisoners in Bangladesh are Muslim. An imam arrives to lead prayers, to recite from the Quran, to sit with the man through the long, dark hours. And then, when the clock moves past midnight, when the date officially changes to the day that was marked on that piece of paper, the guards come. The prisoner's hands are cuffed behind his back. A black cloth is placed over his eyes. He is walked, slowly, carefully, to a wooden structure that has stood in this prison through coups and revolutions and the birth of a nation. The gallows. A rope is placed around his neck. A specific knot, learned, practiced, measured to the exact weight of the man standing on the trapdoor. And then, silence. And then, it is over. For most people, the executioner in a story like this is a faceless figure, a symbol, a dark shape at the end of a dark process. But in Dhaka Central Jail, the executioner had a name. His name was Shah Jahan. And what makes his story extraordinary, what makes it unlike almost anything else connected to this prison, is this: Shah Jahan was not a guard. He was not a government official. He was not hired from the outside. Shah Jahan was a prisoner, a convicted murderer, serving his own sentence inside the same walls as the men he would eventually be asked to kill. If this story is hitting differently than you expected, subscribe right now. Because what Shah Jahan reveals about this prison, about Bangladesh's history, and about human nature itself, goes far beyond what we've covered so far. The story of how Shah Jahan became the hangman of Dhaka Central Jail is one of the strangest true stories to come out of Bangladesh in modern times. He had been convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was not a powerful man. He was not well-connected. He was simply a man sitting in a cell, watching years go by, trying to figure out how to survive. And then, one day, an opportunity appeared. The prison needed someone to operate the gallows. The official hangman, a government-appointed role, was not always available, or not always willing. The job of executing another human being, even in a controlled, legal setting, is something most people want nothing to do with. It sits heavy on the mind. It follows you into sleep. But Shah Jahan volunteered. In exchange, he was told, his cooperation would be considered. His sentence could be reviewed. He might eat better food. He might get small privileges that made prison life more bearable. He said yes. And so began a chapter of his life that would last for decades. Over the years, Shah Jahan carried out somewhere between 26 and 60 executions. The exact number is disputed, and even he gave different answers at different times. He executed war criminals from the 1971 Liberation War. He executed soldiers who had staged coups. He executed murderers. He executed men whose names made front pages of newspapers and men whose names no one remembered. He did it all before sunrise. In silence. With a rope, he learned to prepare himself. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one expected. Years after his time as executioner, after he was eventually released from prison, Shah Jahan began to talk. He sat down and told his story. All of it. the preparations, the condemned men, the nights, the weight of what he had done. And in those conversations, he said something that stopped people cold. He said he believed that at least 3 of the men he had executed were innocent, not guilty of what they were convicted for, not deserving of death. He didn't say he knew for certain. He wasn't a judge. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a man who had looked into the eyes of the condemned in their final moments, and something in those moments, something he couldn't fully explain, had stayed with him. 3 men, gone, and he had been the last person to see them alive. He carried that with him for the rest of his life. Shah Jahan eventually became something of a public figure in Bangladesh. He wrote a book about his experiences. It became a bestseller. He appeared on television. He had a presence on social media. Young people shared his interviews online, not because they celebrated what he had done, but because his story forced a question that no one quite knew how to answer. What does it do to a person to take a life, legally, with the full permission of the state, and then discover, later, that you may have been wrong? Shah Jahan died in June 2024. He never fully answered that question. But the executed men and the executioner are only 2 threads in a much larger story. Because Dhaka Central Jail has witnessed things that go beyond individual lives and individual deaths. It has stood at the center of some of the most violent and chaotic moments in Bangladesh's history. Moments that shaped the country. Moments that are still debated today. And the darkest of those moments happened on a single night. November 3rd, 1975. That night, Bangladesh did not go to sleep the way it normally did. The country was already in shock. Just months earlier, in August, the founding father of the nation, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, had been assassinated in a military coup, along with most of his family. The country had been thrown into confusion. Different factions were fighting for control. No one was sure who was in charge or what would happen next. Inside Dhaka Central Jail, 4 men sat in their cells. These were not ordinary prisoners. These were some of the most important political figures in the country. Men who had been part of the founding government. Men who had helped lead Bangladesh to independence. They had been arrested in the chaos following the August coup. They were Syed Nazrul Islam, Tajuddin Ahmad, Muhammad Mansour Ali, H.M. Quamruzaman, for names that were, at that time, known to every Bangladeshi. On the night of November 3rd, a group of soldiers entered the prison. They did not come with paperwork. They did not come with a court order. They did not follow any legal process. They went to the cells of these 4 men, and they killed them, shot and bayonet inside their own cells, in the middle of the night, without trial, without warning. When morning came, Bangladesh woke up to news that 4 of its most important leaders were dead, murdered inside the very prison that was supposed to hold them safely. To this day, November 3rd is observed in Bangladesh as Jail Killing Day. Schools close. Flags are lowered. The families of those 4 men still carry a grief that has never fully been answered. And if that were the end of the prison's darkest history, it would already be enough. But it wasn't the end. 2 years later, in 1977, something happened inside Dhaka Central Jail that was quieter, but in some ways even more chilling. A military mutiny had broken out. Soldiers had rebelled against the government. The rebellion was put down, and then the trials began. Except they were not trials in any normal sense of the word. Hundreds of soldiers were brought before special military tribunals. These were not regular courts. The men had no lawyers. In many cases, they had no real chance to speak in their own defense. The proceedings moved at a speed that the normal justice system would never allow. And then the sentences came down. Death, 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 death. So many death sentences, so quickly, that the prison's single gallows could not keep up. And so the gallows was extended, rebuilt, modified, to hang 3, sometimes 4 men at the same time. The executions happened in waves. In the dark, before dawn, night after night. The exact number of men executed in that period has never been fully confirmed. The government records from that time are incomplete. Some researchers say dozens. Some say hundreds. The truth, the full, documented, undeniable truth, has never been made public. And that silence, that gap in the record, is its own kind of answer. There is a pattern in the story of Dhaka Central Jail that becomes impossible to ignore the longer you look at it. A pattern of things happening in the dark, of decisions being made quietly, quickly, without the kind of transparency that allows the rest of the world to ask questions, of men going in and sometimes never coming out, of records that don't quite add up, of families who waited for news that never came. And yet, the prison continues. The walls still stand. The condemned cells are still occupied. Right now, as you watch this, there are men inside Dhaka Central Jail who have been sitting in rooms the size of a bathroom for years, waiting for a knock on the door. Some of them are guilty of terrible things. Some of them, and the research strongly suggests this, may not be. And the question of which is which, in a system this broken, this overcrowded, this underfunded, is a question that may never be fully answered. But there is one more layer to this story. One more thing that the walls of this prison have seen. Something that happened not in the past, but in recent years. Something that forced Bangladesh's own courts to look at the condemned cell and say, this has gone too far. Something that shows that even in the darkest places, something can shift. There is a question that sits at the heart of every prison story ever told. Not the question of guilt, not the question of punishment, not even the question of justice. The question is simpler than all of those. It is this: what does it do to a human being to wait? Not to wait for a bus, not to wait for a meal, but to wait for the most important decision of your life in a room the size of a bathroom. With no window, no news, no way of knowing if today is the day, or tomorrow, or 10 years from now. That is the reality of the condemned cell in Dhaka Central Jail. And for a long time, no one in power looked closely enough at that reality to say, something about this is wrong. Until the courts themselves did. In 2024, something unusual happened in Bangladesh. The High Court, the same court that reviews every death sentence, the same court whose confirmation brings a man one step closer to the gallows, issued a ruling about the condemned cell itself. The ruling said this: keeping a prisoner in solitary confinement in the condemned cell before his appeals are fully heard, before every legal option has been exhausted, is a violation of his rights. In Bangladesh, when a lower court sentences a man to death, that sentence is automatically sent to the High Court for review. That process takes time, years. And during all those years of waiting for the review, the prisoner had been placed in the condemned cell immediately. Alone, isolated, cut off. The 2024 ruling said that was not acceptable. A man whose fate has not yet been finally decided should not be treated as if it already has been. It was a small ruling in the grand scale of things. It did not abolish the death penalty. It did not free anyone. It did not undo the past. But it was the first time that Bangladesh's own legal system looked at the condemned cell and said, this specific thing, this isolation before the end of all hope, is too much. And in a place like Dhaka Central Jail, where change comes slowly and silence is the default, that was something. But to understand why that ruling matters, you have to understand what life in the condemned cell actually looks like. Not from a distance, not from a legal document, from the inside. In 2020, a Bangladeshi photographer and researcher named Mosfikar Rahman Johan spent time documenting the lives of death row prisoners and their families. He could not always get inside the prison itself. Access is tightly controlled, and the condemned section is the most restricted part of all. But he spoke to families. He gathered testimonies. He pieced together a picture of daily life in the condemned cell from the words of people who had lived it. What he found was a world defined not by violence, but by stillness. The condemned cell does not feel like a dramatic place, the prisoners said. It feels like a waiting room. Except the waiting never ends, and there are no magazines on the table, and the chair is a mat on a concrete floor. A typical day for a death row prisoner in Dhaka Central Jail begins before sunrise. Morning prayers, for those who pray. A small meal, usually rice and lentils. Then hours. Long, flat, featureless hours with very little to fill them. Some prisoners are allowed books, if their families bring them. Some are allowed to write letters, though the letters must pass through the prison administration and are read before they go out. Some spend their time in prayer. Some spend it in silence. Family visits are allowed, but they are limited and heavily monitored. There is a barrier between the prisoner and his visitor. They speak through a screen or across a table with a guard present. There is no privacy. Whatever you want to say to your mother, your wife, your child, you say it in front of a stranger in a uniform. And then the visit ends, and the family leaves, and you go back to the room. One of the testimonies collected during this research came from a man named Ismail Hossain. He had been on death row for years. His family spoke on his behalf. They described how, in the beginning, Ismail tried to stay strong. He wrote letters. He prayed. He told his children, when they visited, that everything would be okay, that the appeal would succeed, that he would come home. But the years passed. The appeal moved slowly through a system that was handling thousands of cases at the same time. And something in Ismail began to change. Not anger, not madness, something quieter. He stopped talking about coming home. He started talking about smaller things. Whether his daughter was eating properly, whether the mango tree in their yard had given fruit that season, whether his son was doing well in school. His family said it was the hardest thing they had ever witnessed. Not the prison itself, but watching someone they loved learn to live without hope and still choose, every day, to be present for them. And then there are the children. This is a part of the story that rarely gets told. When a man goes to death row, he doesn't go alone. His family goes with him, not into the cell, but into a different kind of confinement, a social confinement. In Bangladesh, family reputation is everything. Where you live, who your neighbors are, whether your children can marry, all of it is tied to how your family is seen by the community. And when a family member is convicted of a serious crime, the damage to that reputation is immediate and severe. The researchers from the University of Dhaka found that the children of death row prisoners were frequently bullied in school. Some were pulled out of school entirely by parents trying to protect them from the cruelty of other children. Some families moved, packed up, and left their villages to find a place where no one knew their name. The researcher Carolyn Hoyle from the University of Oxford, who reviewed the Dhaka study, put it plainly: the death penalty does not only punish the person convicted, it punishes everyone connected to them for the rest of their lives. Because his story does not end with his death in 2024. It ends with a question he left behind. In his later years, when Shah Jahan spoke publicly about his time as executioner, he was not celebrated. He was not condemned. He was something more complicated, a man that Bangladesh didn't quite know what to do with. He had done something legal, something he was asked to do, even encouraged to do. He had operated within a system that the government had built and maintained. He was, in every official sense, following the rules. And yet, the three men he believed were innocent. The question of whether the system that handed him the rope had made mistakes. The fact that once you pull that rope, there is no appeal, no review, no correction possible. He said in one of his final interviews that he used to dream about the men he had executed. Not nightmares, exactly. Just their faces, appearing in the quiet moments before sleep. Looking at him. He said he never found a way to stop it. Bangladesh today is a country in transition. In 2024, after years of political tension, the government changed. New conversations began about accountability, about the justice system, about the rights of ordinary people against the power of the state. Those conversations have not yet fully reached the condemned cell. The death penalty is still in place. The condemned cells are still occupied. The overcrowding is still severe. The 80% of under-trial prisoners, people who have not been convicted of anything, are still waiting. But something is shifting. Slowly. The way things always shift in places where the walls have been standing for a very long time. Lawyers are filing new challenges. Researchers are publishing new findings. The 2024 court ruling on solitary confinement before appeals, small as it was, opened a door that had previously been shut tight. And the families of the men inside those walls, they have not stopped knocking. They carry documents and photographs and petitions. They travel to Dhaka from distant villages. They wait in government corridors. They write letters that may or may not be read. They wait, outside the walls, the way their loved ones wait inside. There is one last thing to know about Dhaka Central Jail. The old building, the original prison that stood in old Dhaka for over 200 years, is being converted into a cultural space. A museum. A place where ordinary people can walk in and learn about the history of the city. Which means that the ground where prisoners once lived, where political leaders were murdered in their cells, where men once waited for death in tiny rooms, that same ground will one day be a place where children come on school trips, where families walk on weekends, where people eat snacks and take photographs. The walls will still be there, cleaned up, repainted, preserved, historical, safe. But the walls remember. They remember 1975 and the 4 men who died in the night. They remember the soldiers executed in waves in 1977, their names not fully recorded, their story not fully told. They remember the farmers and the laborers and the rickshaw drivers who arrived confused and terrified and left, some of them, in white cloth. They remember Shah Jahan, walking those corridors in both directions. First as a prisoner, then as the man the state trusted with its darkest work, then as a prisoner again. And then, finally, as a free man who could not outrun what he had seen. They remember Ismail and the mango tree, and a daughter who needed to know her father was thinking of her even from inside a room with no windows. Every prison holds people, but some prisons hold something more than that. They hold the record of what a society was willing to do and willing to look away from when no one was watching. Dhaka Central Jail is one of those places. The question it leaves us with is not about the prisoners inside. It is about the rest of us on the outside, about what we choose to know, what we choose to ask about, what we decide matters, and what we decide is too uncomfortable to look at. Because the wall that separates us from what happens inside that prison is not just made of brick and concrete. It is made of silence. And silence, as history has shown us, again and again, is never as safe as it feels.